Yeah, I mean, I was never an atheist, ever. But I was raised in a deeply religious family, and I integrated that. We went to church twice a day. We said the rosary at least once a day, at least. We prayed before and after meals. We read the lives of the saints or the Bible every night. Oh, and it wasn't just my 11 siblings and parents, all 29 of the cousins were raised the same way, and we would all see each other at church every morning, et cetera. So it was a really important part of my life. But when my dad was killed when I was 14. I became a heroin addict when I was 15, but I was always fighting my addiction. I was taking heroin without my own permission, and I was doing that for a lot of years. And when you're doing that, when you're living against conscience, which is what happens when you're an addict, you tend to push any kind of notion of God over the periphery of your horizon. So God had become a very, very small thing in my life, and then I had this. I was struggling. By the way, I had very iron willpower in my. Always, from when I was a kid, and very good discipline. I gave up candy for Lent when I was 13. I never ate candy again until I was in college. And I gave up desserts for Lent when I was 14. I never had another dessert till I was in college, and I was bulking up for sport, for rugby. And I felt I could do anything with my willpower, but this compulsion, the drug compulsion, was just impervious to it, and it was cunning, baffling, and demoralizing. And to me, the most demoralizing feature of addiction was my incapacity to keep contracts with myself. I would tell myself at 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm never going to do that again, and at 4 o'clock, I'd be doing it. And it was baffling to me that I could not bind that person who I was going to be later on in the day to do anything. And I knew when I got sober that I had to change in a deep, fundamental way who I was. And because I didn't want to be an addict, but just be white-knuckling it and be miserable all the time and wanting the drug. And I wanted to be just wake up and not want any drugs. And I knew that was going to require a spiritual awakening. I knew from reading the lives of the saints that there had been people who had been living in all kinds of depravity. St. Augustine was one, St. Francis another, who had these spiritual awakenings and just walked away from addiction. And I had a friend who was a friend of my little brother who died of this disease, David, who was a year difference than me. And he took heroin the same way I did, with the same enthusiasm and compulsion. He became a Mooney. He joined the Unification Church and became a follower of Reverend Sun Myung Moon. And he didn't want to take drugs anymore. And he used to still hang out with us, and we would take drugs right in front of him, but he was zero interest. He was completely indifferent to him. And he would chatter about all of his stuff from the Unification Church. And when I got sober in September of '83, I would think about this guy all the time, and I'd think, I'd rather be dead than be a Mooney. That's what I was thinking at that time. But I wish somehow I could distill whatever it was he had that made him, impervious to this compulsion without becoming a religious nuisance. And at that time, I read a book by Carl Jung called Synchronicity, and the short story is that in that book, he tries to use empirical tools and scientific tools to prove the existence of a God, and he fails. But he says in that book that although he can't scientifically prove the existence of a God, he could prove that he ran the biggest sanitarium in Europe, in Zurich, and he said he could prove, having seen tens of thousands of patients come through his facility, that people who believed in God got better faster than people who didn't, and that their recovery was more durable. And for me, that was a more impactful thing than if he had said that he had proved the existence of a God, which I wouldn't have believed. But what he was saying was that it's irrelevant if there's a God up there. If if you believe in one, your chance of staying sober are much better. And I'd already made a commitment to myself that I'd do whatever I needed to do to improve my chances of staying sober by even 1%. So I made a decision, just an intellectual decision. I'm going to start believing in God and recover what I had lost. And then I was presented with the dilemma that anybody who's in that position would face, which is, how do you start believing in something that you can't see or smell or touch or taste or hear or acquire with your senses? And Jung solves that problem. He says, you fake it till you make it. He said, act as if. And he said, the obedience will precede the evidence. In other words, if you start doing what you're supposed to do, that you will then see an evidence of a tangible, undeniable evidence of God's presence in your life. And so I started doing that. I just said, oh, that's what I'm going to do. And I just started pretending that, that there was a God up there watching me all the time, and that everything I did in life was a test. And that, I began breaking my day down into about 40 different decisions. And each of those decisions now, for me, had a moral implication. When the alarm goes off in the morning, do I get immediately out of bed, or do I stay in bed for an extra 20 minutes with my indolent thoughts? Do I make the bed? Most important thing I do during the decision I do every day. Do I hang up the towels, after I use them? When I reach into the closet and pull out a pair of blue jeans and all those little wire hangers fall on the ground, do I shut the door like I used to and say, I'm too much of a big shot, that's somebody else's job? Or do I go in there and clean up my own mess? Do I put the water back in the ice tray before I put the ice tray in the freezer? Do I put the shopping cart where it's supposed to go? And I had this experience when I first got sober. When you're an addict, your life gets very small. But as soon as I got sober, my life started to enlarge dramatically. And I was running about 2 months after, into it. I was running through National Airport in Washington, D.C., and I was late for a plane, and it was mission critical. It was going to be the apocalypse, and I didn't catch that plane. And I was certainly going to miss, almost certainly going to miss it. And as I ran, I was putting a stick of Dentyne in my mouth, and I wrapped up the little wrapper into a ball, and I threw the wrapper, and it made a perfect arch as I was running into the center of a garbage can, and swish right in. But as I was running by it, I saw out of the corner of my eye, it must have hit something in there because it jumped back out. And I was like, well, that's God's problem because I made the shot. But I got about 40 feet from that trash can. It just started eating at me. And finally, I put on the brakes, and I went back, and I threw it in the garbage can. And for me, that's probably the most important thing I did that day, because the big challenge after you have a spiritual awakening, you can't live off the laurels of a spiritual awakening. You have to, and I had a spiritual awakening that just abolished my desire for drugs and alcohol. But you can't live off the laurels. You have to renew it every day. You have to renew it to display service to others, and you have to renew it by staying in that posture of surrender. I came in a total surrender, my life gone, and was willing at that point to turn my life over to God. But then when the cash and prizes start flowing back in, you're like, thanks God, I got it from here. And then, you take the wheel and drive the car off the cliff again, and then you have to come in on your knees. And the big trick is, how do you stay in that posture of surrender even when your life is filling with abundance, And so...
Are you still pretending that God exists?
Yeah, I don't pretend anymore, because Jung says in his book, Jung never had any doubt of God. Jung saw God everywhere, and with such clarity, and with such texture and grace and joy and just material existence. he didn't even understand what it was like to not have faith. His father had been a preacher, but a dry preacher. His father had been a very important preacher, but he never believed it. He was very good at sort of reciting the conventional shibboleths, but he never had an authentic religious experience. And Young had those experiences from when he was 3 years old. His biography is just riveting, which is called Memories, Dreams, and Something Remembrances. But he wrote it when he was 86 years old. And his recitation of these experiences that he had from when he was a kid are fascinating. And, he was, Freud was his mentor. And Freud was a total atheist. And they did a tour of America together by train. It's a fascinating book because they ended up splitting on that issue. And Freud really made himself irrelevant, whereas Jung today is, everywhere. Because his approach to healing was all about kind of spiritual connections.
It's very frustrating that we're more than out of time, but I'd like to think that this might be the first of a number of conversations. It's been a privilege. Thank you, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr.
Thank you.
Really great. Thank you.
Thank you.